Okay. Thanks very much for joining us. Once again, it's Doug Fabrizio here with Radio West, also on behalf of the Utah Film Center. As you can see there, David Byars, the director of the film, standing by, and there in the dim light of where he might be, Hal Herring, we can see you. It's not bad, Hal, but yeah, there you go. Brilliant. Hal, welcome to you. Thanks very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Well, I'm already seeing questions, which is something that doesn't surprise me. It's already prompting a lot of reaction. And so we're going to get to your questions here in a moment. Again, please use that chat function and we'll get to as many of these questions as we can. We'll try to be with you for another 20 minutes, half an hour perhaps. So let's jump in. One of the things I think I wanted to start, if you all would indulge me with a question or two before we do jump in. David Byars, you first. What is it about this story, public land, and the theme that interests you? Like, basically, in basic terms, what's the idea here that really interests you in particular?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Doug. I mean, that's the question I've been trying to answer for the past 4 years of my life. But there's something. I think there's this kind of yearning in all of us to feel some kind of connection to something ancient. It's something that a lot of us don't have, and we don't have a rich cultural tradition going back thousands and thousands of years. And so for me, like trying to understand this land that we're living on and trying to know what it means, particularly within the context of what it means to be an American, which is something I do identify with, in the past 200 years. Is really interesting to me, and like feeling out what this ancient concept of land and man's relationship to land within this modern context of what it means to be an American is something that's always been fascinating to me on a very like fundamental level, in a way that's kind of hard for me to articulate even.
Hal Herring, I wanted to ask you, one of the things that David, we were all talking about in the radio last week was the sort of philosophical underpinnings of this idea of public land. David's talked about the fact that it's something he's still learning, and he says it's a really vast topic, a vast physical object. So how do you think about the philosophical underpinnings? I mean, we see you expressing this in the film, the idea that it's a deeply American idea, an American experiment. Just give us a sense of your idea of the philosophical underpinnings of this big concept of land.
Well, that's a tall order, but it's a good question. One of the things I think is most interesting about the experiment in the United States of America is the contradictions inherent in our lives and in our country. We might be the most contradictory people ever. And I heard this described recently in a book called In Defense of Public Lands, and it said that the idea that we would have these millions of acres of incredibly beautiful country held in common in the most Lockean nation in the world, referring to James Locke, is just it's just absolutely, it's kind of unfathomable. And I think that's what makes it so interesting. And I think to have a vast American commons and still hold tight to our like sacred private property rights are still very sacred in our and as I believe they should be, but to hold these balancing elements is just amazing. It's completely unique. I promise.
Let me jump to some questions, David. As I said, we're getting a lot of people interested in wanting to ask you something. Here's a good question. This did occur to me as well. Someone wants to know if you reached out to Jason Chaffetz, if you reached out to Ryan Zinke for interviews, and what sort of reaction, what sort of runaround, I think is how they put it. Yeah, you would get.
Yeah.
You got.
We did reach out to several folks who would be considered on the kind of opposite end of the spectrum in terms of public lands, and we were given very peremptory refusals essentially, and I wanted to hear their perspectives. I wanted to hear their reasonings for things, but I didn't really hold out much hope that I would be given good faith answers either. But that's something that I would love to like really sit down and discuss with them, and what their vision is for the future of public lands, and what that means for someone like me or anyone who's a regular American who's not rich. Like I would love to understand what their vision for America is under kind of this. And I don't want to put words in their mouth, but like they are screaming towards deregulation and privatization. But I don't know how that interview would go, and whether I can like really. I would love to sit, and I think Hal has some experience with this, but I'd really love to sit down with someone who would say, yeah, I'd like to see public lands privatized, and here's why. But I don't think there's many people that would do that.
Talk about that, Hal. Talk about, do you get any direct answers to that question when you pose it?
I don't think I've gotten direct answers for that question from anybody in a position of authority since 2000, the year 2000, when I first wrote the story about this called "No Place Whatsoever." I haven't, and Terry Anderson, who was a political economist, I think in Bozeman, he said he was fine. He was really good. It was very honest. He said we'd have true multiple use. Some people could buy land and preserve it. Other people could do X, Y, or Z with it. We wouldn't have all these conflicts. He was totally honest. But since then, this entire movement has learned to couch itself in other language. Montana Senator Jennifer Fielder, she's fairly straightforward about what she thinks should be done. And that is to transfer the land over to the states and let the states do as they would with them, So Jennifer Fielder has been fairly straightforward.
Well, I would say even
Can
like
I add what they don't add though, what they don't even Senator Fielder, they don't give you the next phase, which is almost certainly the sale of these lands after they're transferred to the state. And so in that way, it's not totally straightforward.
David, go ahead.
That was the exact point I was going to make.
Yeah. It seems like the idea has gone underground then. There's a lack of transparency to it now, which could lead you to what conclusion, Hal, that there's a more sinister sort of conclusion that they have in mind, that they're really not. Terry may have been interested in multiple use once you privatize these lands, but maybe they're not even interested in that. I mean, what explains the fact that there's no transparency anymore, not a willingness to be open about what their actual intent might be?
Because they know that what they're selling is not something that most Americans would want to buy. Senator Mitt Romney, who has made a mark as a moderate lately, and voted no on the Great American Outdoors Act, which would have brought $1.9 billion per year to the national backlog of maintenance on the national parks, which are, by the way, a cornerstone of Utah's economy. Why would he do that?
Let's go back to some questions. Here's a question. Yeah. Here's a question. How do we get Congress, is the question. How do we get Congress to act on public lands instead of presidential action, which, as this person asks, is easily undone by the next one? What do you think? David Byars, you start with that.
Yeah, well, the Antiquity Act was never designed to be so easily undone, and there are several court cases challenging President Trump's right to actually do that. In terms of Congress, we've kind of reached this phase where there's this kind of domineering Republican Party that's moved the Overton window so far to the right, and we're all playing in that stadium right now, and the Democratic Party seems somewhat feckless in terms of what they want to do and how they're trying to actually create change in this nation, whether it's public lands or anything else. As you can see, I'm a bit of a cynic right now, but I think what we need to do is absolutely make certain things off limits to either party. And like one of those things is the exploitation of public lands. And the way you do that is just by being super noisy about it and like being very active about it and get friends, make it fun, and like get out there and make a ton of phone calls and say, you know, the only way these people are going to overcome their fear of their donors is to have them fear their voters. And that's what we need to do.
Hal, you want to add something to that?
Not really. I think that's exactly right. I'm perhaps less cynical about it because the Republican Party is a party in search of a cause now. And I think that this is an obvious thing to abandon. You're going to have to vote in different Republicans. But the American people are going to have to, who identify as conservatives, are going to have to prioritize public lands and clean water and clean air and things like that, and let the people that they elect then carry those issues forward for them. Right now, we haven't prioritized those things.
I wanted to ask David, you first, sort of a two-part question that I was interested in, like the ideological basis as you understand it from working on this story, both of you working on this story, because this, like, what did you learn from No Man's Land, for example? That was, that whole takeover of Malheur was ideological. It was just, and I'm wondering what the connection is there, the ideological part. That's the first part. What did you learn about the ideology as you understand it? And then for Hal, how do you tease that out? How do you tease out the political ideological-ish part from this? Because you have a lot of people with very different partisan, dispositions who have this one thing in common, this affection for the land, this belief in public land. So David, start there if you would. How do you understand the ideology that's at work here first?
Sure. I mean, I think it all stems from that kind of laissez-faire, like Lockean economics that Hal was talking about earlier, where cooperation is shunned and every man is an island. And I think human history, we've been around for 2 million years. Like human history completely, goes in the face of that in terms of how we've survived and how we've thrived on this planet. And I think we need to I'm not going to espouse my own point of view here, but I think that's what it comes from. It's this kind of misguided ideology that every man is an island, and that like fierce competition rather than cooperation is what's going to provide the best results.
Hal, say something about that, and then whether or not that you can now at this point, if it's not such a tight knot that you can't really undo the ideology from it. How are you seeing that, if that makes any sense?
Well, I mean, I agree with David, and I would say fierce competition and cooperation is the way humanity has made its best advances. But if humanity has made advances, in this country, Doug, we've been the beneficiaries of some very hard-fought battles and wars and blood and treasure, and we have a lot of people now on every side of the political spectrum who have no idea how these battles were won or why they have it so good, and they are free to entertain these sort of radical ideologies without any consequence. I mean, I have friends in the libertarian world who I swear they are not particularly competitive. They would not thrive in the society that they claim to want, but other wiser heads have prevented that from happening. So you're pretty much free to preach any ideology you want.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a byproduct of successful civilization, but it also collapses that. So you get what you want, maybe in the end. I'm not trying to be grim.
Why? Here's a question from Andrew. Andrew wants to know, why was grazing included when, as he puts it, it's so destructive and produces so little food for the country? David and Hal, talk about where grazing fits in the story.
Sure. That's a tough one. And we actually, debated whether or not to include grazing in this. But at the end of the day, this is a big tent movement, and ranchers and that whole iconography has an oversized influence in terms of policy in this country. And so we felt it was important to include that in there to not only like say, you know, we should just lock these lands away forever, but also there are uses for these lands that could be done well. And we were actually very careful about the ranchers we chose, and they're ones who are, you know, doing what we would consider a good job on public lands in terms of caring about the watersheds and working with the federal agencies to do the right things to keep these public lands intact and not only productive, but also not only productive for cattle, but also, you know, natural and productive for clean watersheds and diverse wildlife and functioning ecosystems.
Hal, talk a little bit about that. The film does make the case that none of this actually came from grassroots. This effort to privatize it necessarily didn't come from rank and file Americans or ranchers or working class Americans necessarily, that it was a strategy paid for larger interests. So where does, as you see it, where does ranching fit into this story and this question of grazing?
Well, I mean, it can't be separated. And from just a 10,000 foot level, grazing is an appropriate use of public lands in some places, and in other places it's not. And we've actually been fairly effective in working through that, and more effective than most people know, doing grazing buyouts and in places like the desert, you know. But I mean, there are places where grazing is a completely appropriate use of public lands, and we need to, you know, make that better, not just like blanket throw it out. One of the things I'd like to throw in there in talking about grassroots versus astroturf versus 10,000 foot is we cannot ever abandon rural economies in the West or the East in favor of some type of utopian vision of public lands. We have to have a pragmatic approach that includes, Teddy Roosevelt himself said emphatically, this will never work if it doesn't have local support. And I think we could build local support. The alternative vision has swept many local people into kind of an anti-public lands camp, which in my research shows that will be against their interest in the long run, but it's kind of fun in the short run to say that you hate the feds and the Forest Service and the BLM and the tortoises and the manatees or whatever, you know. It's a lot of fun in the short run.
Yeah. There's a couple of filmmaking questions, David, let me put to you. Somebody wanted to know how you were making these hard decisions in post-production with such a complex issue going on, how you went about putting together the story in the edit. As somebody mentioned, they thought this was incredible work. Just talk a little bit about that part, because you have all of this information you've got to synthesize, the decisions that you have to make. Talk a little bit about that part, if you would.
Yeah, sure. So like I mentioned in the intro, you know, when we came to Patagonia to try to get funding for this film, me and Jeremy like literally had like a 2-pager on like kind of the philosophical overview of how we're going to make this film. And a lot of it has to do with like what Hal said about being inclusive of rural communities in his last answer. And so we started from there, and man, like there were two simultaneous feelings when Patagonia greenlit the film. It was like, heck yes, and it was, oh crap, you know, because we had our work out for us in the next 2 years. And so we set about finding kind of the main 3 modern conflicts. There was 3 things going on here. We set out trying to find the main modern conflicts, which were kind of pretty obvious in terms of being the Boundary Waters, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and Bears Ears. There are many, many, many more, but those were the 2 that kind of leapt out at us. The second being like the historical context of it, which, you know, includes the whole like history of the Sagebrush Rebellion and Teddy Roosevelt and all that stuff. And we created an entire timeline with just that stuff in it. The third being kind of how do we connect all this stuff and like and also get it kind of this philosophical underpinnings of not only the modern conflicts, but the historical context of it. And that's where Mr. Hal Herring came in there. He's not just devilishly handsome, but it turns out he has some thoughts on the subject. So we recruited Hal, made him drug him around for a little bit, and then started following him around when he got his own head full of steam. And then that's kind of how this came about. And it was a really big conversation once we had identified the historical context and the modern day kind of conflict. It was always a big conversation with me and Jeremy and Hal and Lyman, our editor, and Drew Xanthopoulos, our cinematographer. Just talking about this the whole time. And we spent a ton of time with Hal. We slept on his couch. We slept on the floor of his office and just hung out with him and picking his brain the whole time, trying to get at this thing. And then and like at the end of the day, you have to give a lot of credit to the editor, Lyman Smith, to like taking these hundreds and hundreds of hours of like sometimes just wildly rambling conversations, getting way off topic, and putting it into something coherent, and got to give a lot of credit to him for that.
I wanted to ask what role Patagonia played in all of this, beyond just being a supporter, beyond being a funder for the project. What kind of role did Yvon Chouinard have in this, his sort of view on public land, on his larger perspective, when you felt like you had to push back just so you could maintain some sort of editorial integrity and independence? I mean, how did you strike that balance?
Yeah, so they really kind of where we set the tone for the film and kind of set our crosshairs on the balance we wanted to get was really in those first conversations we had with them. And it was really important to us as filmmakers to have independence and have final cut without any limitations on that. And it was actually important for Patagonia to do that as well. Like, to their credit, they gave us final cut in the contracting phase and said, go do it. Like, check in with us every now and then. We'll give you feedback. They're hyper intelligent people working at Patagonia. They know how to make films. They know how to, pluck heartstrings, and they know policy, and they know what's going on. And so in that sense, they were very, very helpful along the way to like kind of point us to things that were going on, help us identify characters and stuff like that. And then, in terms of Yvon Chouinard's kind of involvement, he set the tone for Patagonia, which set the tone for the film. They make decisions based on what they believe in, not necessarily what's the best for their business. And it's just coincidentally been great for their business, but also, you see that in their films as well. And like, this one's no exception. And in that sense, like, it was fantastic working with them in terms of having like editorial independence on making the film the way we wanted to make it. And they had very strong opinions about things, but at the end of the day, it was always our decision on what to include in the film and what not to. And I don't know if you noticed, but there's not a single Patagonia label in the film, and that was something that was important to us, and it was also important to them as well, because they do want us to be seen as an independent piece of art and as an independent documentary, and not just branded content. And that's a conversation we had constantly with them.
Hal, have you ever fished with Chouinard? I wondered about that.
I have. Yeah. We did a Field and Stream story called The Allies. And it was Chouinard showed up here, and he sat at the library where my wife is a librarian. And then we connected and went up river to the edge of the Bob Marshall and fished for cutthroats. And he's a tenkara fisherman, no reel. And he's brought all of this down to this like ultimate level of simplicity. And he is an incredible person to fish with. He doesn't talk while he's fishing. Really, he showed me the tenkara stuff, but he was he's definitely the kind of person that you'd want to fish with. I mean, he's really intense about it, as he is about most of his outdoor stuff. It was a very successful trip. We caught a lot of fish.
Yeah. Well, let's bring it to a question that's come up. Sorry, David, go ahead.
I was saying, Hal, there's a funny story about finding him in your wife's library that you left out.
Yeah, I went up there and I said, well, my wife called and said there's this strange man waiting in the library, and he didn't think that was funny at all. It was we set off on the trip from there. It was a great trip.
Well,
we actually went out the night before and caught some grayling in a small lake north of here. It was pretty successful.
Yeah. Well, let's go to the current situation. It's a question that's come up a few times. Jill wants to know, update us on the current situation. And of course, the question I think on her mind and the mind of a lot of people is just what does this election mean? Clearly people understand the stakes, I suppose, but how are you thinking about it in this moment? And not just an election year, but we should also talk about this moment of this deep awakening of protest over racial equality in the midst of a pandemic, of course. I mean, there's a lot going on. So where does this story fit with all of that?
Yeah. Oh man, that's a huge question, Doug. I think to answer your last question first, like we have to think about, and I don't love this term, but we have to think about intersectionality and like what racial justice has to do with public lands and what public lands has to do with racial justice and what it has to do with the pandemic. I think the pandemic is pretty obvious to make a connection to it. Like we still have these wide open spaces that we can go visit. And they're going to be even more important if we have to social distance for the foreseeable future, and so that's just a small facet of what that means in terms of that. In terms of racial justice, we have to make sure that this is something that everyone cares about. And to make sure that everyone cares about it, we have to be very inclusive. And it's not something we just say everyone's welcome. It's something we have to be active in getting people involved with, because those are powerful voices and huge constituencies that you want to care about public lands right now. And like, because otherwise, like you've seen it in the past, we've repeated ourselves over and over again. If we feel like we've quote unquote won, like a lot of things fall by the wayside and we don't hold feet to the fire anymore. And that's something that we have to make sure we do no matter what happens with this election that happens, that's coming up in November.
Hal, what do you think?
My hope is that someday we're going to have, what we're doing right now with racial justice, with inequality of income as well as life experience. We're asking ourselves, how do we create a nation that honors the vision of those who came before us and honors a vision that we all want to live in? I think that includes a vast number of public lands, and it includes 62% of the water in the arid West, without which there's not much to argue over in the cities. I go back to that John Jeevons quote that they use in the movie. All of our art and all of our pretensions, they rely on the fact that there's 6 inches of topsoil and the fact that it rains. So the ecosystem resilience luxury that we have in the public lands and the necessity that we have in the public lands is part of this vision. And it will be up to us to make sure we hold on to that, and then make sure that Americans of every background understand the beauty and the value and their stake in it. And that's kind of a vision. It's not just my vision. I mean, it's the only vision there, right? It's the only real way that we're gonna make this thing work. And I've seen so many hopeful and positive things in that very realm of people enjoying public lands, enjoying freedom, enjoying land and water conservation fund parks in the cities. I mean, we know how to do this.
Here's a question, and we've seen various versions of this question. I guess it's an obvious one. What is the distribution plan, David, for the film? Some of the questions are, what about PBS, national PBS Utah, availability to stream? Right. People want to see it. They want to share it. They want to be a part of it. What's the answer to that?
Yeah. So we are trying to find distribution. It's a difficult year for that. There's so many different things that are kind of clamoring for attention. Whether it's that, whether it's the film itself, whether it's how we made the film, we've been struggling to get national distribution on this one. I would like to start reaching out to like the local PBS stations to try to get this out there in a large way. Suffice it to say that Patagonia is not motivated by making its money back on the film. So in one way, shape, or another, before the fall, or maybe during the early reaches of the fall, once we've exhausted the options, this will be out there in some way that's free for everyone and widely shareable to anyone who wants to watch it. And I do not have the email address with me right now, but there is a way to arrange your own screenings of this film right now, if you want to, through Picture Motion. And I don't have the email address with me right now. It's the first time it's occurred to me. But if you follow public_trust on Instagram, I'll post all that information there once I do that.
Okay, David, we'll put a link to it, by the way, on our website at Radio West, okay. And Davey, I'm sure they will to it at the Film Center. I wanted to come back around to something somebody mentioned. Someone this evening said they were great Indigenous people. Their voice and connection, as this person said, is important moving forward together. I wanted to ask about, of course, that brings up Angelo Bacca, who plays a role in the film, as those of you know. It was a really important part. And it comes back around to that thing that we talked about this on the radio, his perspective in the film, the thing that he talks about, the importance of surviving and hearing from his elders from another generation to say, this is the work you have to do for this generation, but we'll endure it. Would you talk a little bit about that? Because that seemed like such a centering kind of message that we come back to in this film. David, you first.
Sure. I mean, I think like what Angelo represents is something that he's felt from birth, which is this perspective that extends back, 10,000 years. And for me, yeah, I mean, good Lord, like that's not something I grew up with. So for me, it's something that I'm still trying to fully comprehend. And I don't know if I ever will, like, feel intrinsically like in tune with that perspective, while still acknowledging that it's very, very real. But I think like he reaches back in the depths of time in a way that I could not. And I know that Hal actually connected with him. And particularly was moved by his time in southern Utah as well.
Hal,
say something about that, would you?
Well, I mean, first I'd say that I didn't know anything about this film. One of the great things that happened on this film was to connect with Bernadette Dementieff and with Angelo and his mother Ida, with Jim Minote down in Zuni Pueblo, and Sean Chapoose was one of the greatest interviews of my career as a journalist, I can tell you, and I didn't have to ask very many questions. It just this perspective, and I'll just use, since we're talking about Angelo, the perspective of an inhabitant of a place who carries that DNA, that blood for thousands of years like that, or Bernadette up in Fort Yukon on the river there. That was something that I needed for my personal edification, and I didn't know it. And my perspective on the public lands was lacking before I walked through those canyons with Angelo, or walked down that river with Bernadette. And I have more hope for the future. Although I think we touched on this last time we talked. The rescission, the reduction of the Bears Ears is particularly important, and it needed to be in this film because the 5 tribes had come together to take part in federal land management, and we were making the model at the Bears Ears. And when President Trump turned and rescinded the monument and said, "This one's for you, Orin," they declared something there that was very, very plain. And we should be pondering on that as we think about these Native American perspectives on the public land. We should ponder the rescission of the Bears Ears National Monument and the tossing away of years of work where the Native American voice was integral part of public lands management, which it's going to be going forward.
Well, I think that's a nice note to end this conversation. Let me just add one more question, and it comes from someone this evening. It's something that, Hal, you mentioned. One of the things that drew you into this work was that you noticed there wasn't a natural constituency to support public land. And this person, B, they identify themselves, says, is there a comparable pro-public lands think tank to go against the anti-public lands group mentioned in the film? Maybe you can say something, both of you, a little bit about that. Of course, is Land Tani of Backcountry Hunters and Anglers talks about this awakening of the people. Are you seeing finally some awakening here that gives you hope, I guess?
You want to go first, Al?
Go ahead, David.
Oh, right on. If there's a comparable, like, kind of pro-public lands group out there, I would say it's the Backcountry Hunters and Anglers. Also, there's, the Department of Influence. There's you guys have a ton of organizations, nonprofits in Southern Utah and stuff like that. In terms of like a large think tank like the Heritage Foundation or PERC or anything like that, Alec, I don't know if I could think of anything that would be as influent. Honestly, there's just not as much money in conservation. You can't get. I don't know if you can get rich off conservation or not. You certainly can get rich off of capturing government entities and having them give away assets that belong to the American people for pennies on the dollar. But I don't know if there's anything that, like, any kind of juggernauts that are pro public lands like that. I think that's why it's got to be a genuine grassroots movement. That's why we just all have to care. We all have to bring friends along the way.
Hal, give us a final word, would you?
Well, there's nothing on the order of the Heritage Foundation or the American Legislative Exchange Council. Backcountry Hunters and Anglers is increasing by leaps and bounds in membership by people who love to fish and hunt and camp and hike on public land and not, but mostly public land. That's a great thing, and I love it, and I host their podcast, and I have a good time with them. It's not enough, and we're going to have to get the word out to people. By the way, to go back, PERC they are not a privatization movement, part of the privatization movement at this point. They've rethought this idea. Whether that's 100% solid or not, I don't know, but I'm in contact with them, and they say that they've rethought that idea. And so that's is very hopeful, right? But we're going to need people from all over the United States to understand this idea, what we've got. And when we get that, I believe that the preponderance of the evidence lies on the side of maintaining, prioritizing, and keeping the vast majority of the public lands.
Hal Herring, Thank you very much for joining us. David Byars, congratulations to you. And thank you all, those of you out there who watched tonight. It was tremendous, the reaction that we got. And so thank you very much for joining us this evening. Thanks all. Stay safe and good luck.
Thanks, Doug. Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Good night.